Okay, good morning or good afternoon to everybody. My name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And I'm really happy to welcome everybody today for this panel discussion entitled Back to the Water's Edge, Historicizing Current American Security Policies in the Asia Pacific. So just to give a little structure today, we will begin, we'll introduce our speaker and then our discussants. And then following that, our speaker will present about a 30-minute talk, followed by three discussants who will spend about 8 to 10 minutes each in the discussion, followed by a response by our speaker. And then we will open the floor to the audience for any questions that you might have. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce today Professor Mesrob Vartavarian, who is currently a fellow at the Harvard Asia Center. He studied history at UCLA, where he earned his BA and MA degrees, and then a PhD from Cambridge University. He began his career as a scholar of early colonial South Asia, but has since shifted his research focus to security questions relating to the Asia-Pacific region since 1945. His interests also include American foreign relations, Praetorian politics, and borderland insurgencies by ethnic minorities in Southeast Asia. His publications have appeared in the journals Modern Asian Studies, the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, South Asian Research, the Kyoto Review of South Asia, and the IAS newsletter. He has also recently completed a substantial review essay that's forthcoming in the Journal of Asian Studies entitled Circulating Soldiers, Asian Military Labor Across the American Pacific, which reviews 3 new publications. He's currently working on a project entitled Strategic Recalibrations, America's Early Cold War Alliances in Rimland Asia. Our discussants will include first, Professor Vincenzo Bollettino, who is the director of the Resilient Communities Program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and he also leads the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative's engagement in the National NGO Program on Humanitarian Leadership. He completed his PhD at the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And before his current academic appointment, he served as the executive director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative for 5 years. Professor Bollettino has 25 years of professional and academic experience in disaster preparedness and resilience, civil military engagement in emergencies, and the humanitarian and in humanitarian leadership generally. He spent about the past 18 years of his career at Harvard in research, teaching, and administration, and he's currently the president of the Action Against Hunger International Scientific Committee. His current research focuses on civil military engagement during humanitarian emergencies, disaster preparedness and resilience, the professionalization of the humanitarian aid field, and humanitarian leadership. So thank you for joining us. Second will be Professor Carter Eckert, who is the Yoon Professor of Korean History at Harvard University in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, a position he's held since 2004. He served as the director of the Korea Institute at Harvard from 1993 to 2004 and has been teaching modern Korean history at Harvard since 1985. Professor Eckert is the author of Offspring of Empire, The Colonial Origins of Korean Capitalism, 1876 to 1945, which received the John K. Fairbank Prize in East Asian History from the American Historical Association, and also the John Whitney Hall Book Prize from the Association for Asian Studies. He is the co-author of Korea Old and New, A History, which is a widely used university textbook on Korean history. In 1996 and 7, Professor Eckert was a visiting fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he's also spent an extensive amount of time working and studying in Korea before his doctoral work at the University of Washington. Professor Eckert's latest book is Pak Jung-hae and Modern Korea, The Roots of Militarism, 1866 to 1945, published by Harvard Press in 2016, which is the first published volume of his current study of Korean militarization and the rise of Korean militarism. So thank you for joining us, Professor Eckert. And our final respondent will be Professor Aki Nakai, who is the Policy Innovations Fellow at the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He holds a BA in Political Science from Waseda University, an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and a PhD in Political Science from Boston University. From 2019 to 2021, he was a visiting assistant professor of government and Asian studies at Bowdoin College, and his research interests include international relations, security studies, especially military alliances, East Asian politics, and Japanese foreign policy. His writings were previously published in National Interest and The Diplomat. And as a Policy Innovations Fellow, Professor Nakai will teach government N94N, which is entitled Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy during this fall semester. Professor Nakai is currently working on why and how is Japan responding to the emerging technologies, especially after artificial intelligence. So thank you for joining us as well. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Vartavarian for his presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, James. Thank you to the three discussants for their interest and for attending. And I'd also like to thank Tenzin for arranging the technicalities and the various coordinative efforts that went into making this seminar possible today. So my presentation is in 3 steps. I would like to begin with a very brief excursus, if you like, outside the region in question and discuss the shift that is taking place in US foreign policy or US geopolitical strategy more generally from the Asian mainland to the Asian rimland. Then I would like to discuss the security policies in question pursued by the United States during the Cold War period along the Asian rimland, so Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And then the third step, as it were, will be a discussion of contemporary security policies along that same rimland in that same sequence, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. Now, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the very sudden and some say botched, some say misguided withdrawal from Afghanistan that took place over this summer indicates to me that the United States is withdrawing from attempts at nation building across undergoverned or indeed ungoverned spaces. It is a realization after 2 decades of rather ill-considered attempts to impose governmentality on spaces and cultures that are not conducive to the forms that the United States wants to impart. It is a withdrawal from that experiment and attempt and a redistribution of American strategic power more heavily in favor of a rimland maritime Asian approach to contain a rising China. So that is the, at base, broader context of what we are seeing here today. One, there are various stories in the media that see it as a sort of sign of US decline or a sign of a waning of American power. That to me is, it's still unclear. To me, it's much more a redistribution of American power than it is an indication of a rise or of a decline as such. Certainly, there were pivots prior to this very hard, what I like to call Biden's hard pivot to Asia. But those pivots were punctured and impeded under George H.W. Bush, what's called in some IR circles the pivot before the pivot took place, a consideration that America must establish a security architecture in the Asia Pacific that would make it harder for China to challenge the United States. But at base, what the Asia Pacific was a area from which the United States attempted to project power into the Middle East to fight its wars on terror. The drawing down of the American troop presence in South Korea is an indication of that. The second division being drawn down for the wars in the greater Middle East, yes. And Obama's pivot to Asia in 2009, 10, 11, this pivot to Asia was even more severely hampered and impeded by the Afghan surge, which I think strategically was a misguided concept, and of course the Arab uprisings and subsequent collapse of places like Libya, Syria, also Yemen, of course. So there were attempts to pivot to Asia before, but I think this pivot is far more decisive and indicative of a a redistribution, a recalibration of American power away from the mainland to the rimland, while simultaneously turning against a rising mainland Chinese power or superstate, or however you'd like to define it. Right? So everything I say subsequently, I must be positioned within this broader geopolitical global context. Right? Now, the United States is coming to a place where it, of course, never really left and has a very long and complicated history. In its Cold War manifestation, and here I would also like to engage with the work of two scholars, two recent contributions by Victor Cha and also Kenneth Pyle, who have written about this subject. Victor Cha in the Cold War context and Kenneth Pyle in the Cold War, but also a more contemporary context. So Victor Cha's thesis, the power play thesis, as it's called, which had some earlier manifestations, but is most cogently argued in his book, Power Play, which is about early American alliances in East Asia, indicates that at base, bilateralism, which is the manner in which the US engages with East Asia or Rimland Asia, is a product of or resulted from an effort to control allies, to make sure that those allies would not entrap the United States or push the United States into contingencies that it did not want. So in general, he is going for a kind of homogenized system-wide theory. There are certainly variations in his theory, in the sense that Japan, unlike, say, South Korea under the Ri regime, was not a irredentist state, a loose cannon state, as he defines it, but it was indeed a state that wanted to reestablish economic linkages with the People's Republic of China, and it had to be dissuaded from that persuasion and that disposition and pushed in a different direction, a Southeast Asian direction, as opposed to an Asian mainland direction. All right. But at base, his theory is one of homogenization, control, the avoidance of entrapment. That's certainly true in a very broad-based geopolitical context. However, in terms of service provision and the respective services that the United States mobilized from the cases he's looking at Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, but you can also apply this to the Philippines. The strategic services provided by these allied states were in fact highly distinct and course through a very highly distinct set of bilateral trajectories. All right. And let me just go down this list and complicate the picture, drawing out, or very, very broadly painting out for you a composite security architecture, in the sense that the specific strategic and security services obtained by the United States in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines were highly distinct, also Taiwan. But I'll leave Taiwan aside for the purposes of this presentation. However, if one wants to raise Taiwan in the discussion, I'd be more than happy to engage with that question if you're interested. In Japan, at base, however much the United States wanted to re-engage Japan strategically in the region, through a kind of comprehensive rearmament and deployment of Japanese soldiers to the region, at base, the United States had to settle, for all kinds of very complex reasons, for bases rather than soldiers. It managed to obtain and retain strategic platforms from which it could project power onto the Asian mainland, most specifically, of course, in Korea during the Korean War, and the Indochina War, just as substantially and just as importantly. Japan remained, in terms of the military personnel within that state, a defense-only state that was strategically passive in a direct sense. It provided bases from which the US could project strategic power, but its military personnel remained defense only, domestically focused or nationally focused, and strategically, regionally passive. This wasn't easy. This took a lot of back and forth, arm twisting and cajoling. But the United States did, at base, accept it. One of the reasons it accepted it, this is one of the main points I'm trying to make here, is that South Korea provided that strategic military labor needed by the United States, certainly for the first 2 decades of the Cold War. When it came to South Korea, yes, the United States had bases. It had tactical nuclear weapons from 1958 to 1991. But I think the most crucial strategic service provided by the South Koreans was a strategic reserve of anti-communist military labor. Soldiers that could be within a very broad framework. We have a pool of strategic military labor in South Korea, and we want to gear it, nudge it, configure it in such a way that it serves evolving strategic intentions. So, in the 1940s, when the United States occupies Korea militarily, has a military government in Southern Korea, and then thereafter, through a kind of military advisory mission, the primary mission of the South Korean army, and I stress army because this is the branch of the military that is most overwhelmingly involved with the United States, really until the present day, is involved in counterinsurgency and conventional, shall we say, static conventional defense on the 38th parallel, right? Again, this doesn't come through just top-down administrative fiat from the United States. And there is no overarching intentionality to this. There is no systemic planned policy to this. The United States throughout the Cold War is responding to a series of unforeseen contingencies. Nevertheless, it uses what Victor Cha would call power play to restrain South Korea, yes, but also to mold South Korean or configure South Korean military labor in ways that serve wider US strategic interests. Sometimes the South Koreans are on board with this, no question. The Park Chung-hee regime enthusiastically signed up for the Vietnam War, providing two Army infantry divisions, a Marine brigade, other support units, up to about 50,000 troops. And of course, ultimately sending in total, with rotations and whatnot, something around 300,000 troops. In that respect, South Korea is willing to sign up for it without too much pressurization by the US to a certain point. However, when the United States wants to restrain Korea, pull it back from irredentism, then it faces a tremendous amount of resistance right through the 1950s, particularly in the Eisenhower administration. The Eisenhower administration repeatedly says, your function is a anti-communist bulwark. You have to contain the North. We don't want you to roll back the North. We tried that in 1950, and the results were not good for us and probably not very good for you either. So we are going to restrain you in that irredentist function. You become a bulwark. If we need you for imperial activities in Indochina, then we will mobilize you and we will appropriately reward you. And it must be stressed, of course, that the restraint function also comes with substantial rewards for the re-regime. The agreed minute on aid in 1954 provided at that time something like $700 million in military and economic aid in 1954, $700 million. And of course, in 1968, after the January 1968 Blue House raid, Park does want to retaliate against the North. The United States exercises extreme pressure and also provides further sweeteners in terms of military credits and weaponry in order to hem Park back in. So it's military labor that is evolving over time, serving different functions through a kind of bargaining process. Yes, we coerce, we, meaning the United States, uses coercion, it uses compulsion, but it also uses these aid guarantees, which helps the South Korean military expand and sustain itself. With regard to the Philippines, there is a very interesting combination. At base, the Philippines is also a base area from which the US projects power into the Asia Pacific and pursues wider strategic objectives. So, for example, during the Taiwan Straits crises of the 1950s, a lot of those activities to deter a Chinese aggression were organized through Clark Air Base and Subic Bay, Subic Naval Base. And of course, the Clark and Subic complex plays a essential function as a staging area for the Indochina War, much as Okinawa plays a staging area for the Indochina War and also a platform from which to launch B-52 strikes. So Okinawa is more deeply involved, naturally, because at this time it is still occupied by the United States. In terms of direct participation by Philippine military personnel, yes, there are contingents that are sent to the Korean War, a very minor contingent, and there are civic action troops that are sent to Vietnam. These are more symbolic and a way in which the United States, basically the Marcos regime, wants to provide civic action troops because it can obtain aid from the United States, aid which it can then divert into electoral slush funds to consolidate its power and then embed a kind of martial law emergency regime over the Philippine archipelago. The primary function of the Philippine military, however, is base defense, to make sure that there is not a contingency, an outcome domestically, not kind of externally inspired or a kind of external infiltration or communization of the Philippines, but a domestic leftist agrarian series of movements that can neutralize the Philippines, make it less receptive to a US military presence, or indeed quite possibly end the US military presence. So when the Marcos regime becomes less focused on state defense, state security, and becomes obsessed with regime defense and regime security, then the United States shifts. When Marcos is useful as a one-man dictator that can provide the United States with unhampered access to the bases, that's totally fine. However, when his regime is fomenting the very leftism that could endanger those bases, then the United States shifts the political dispensation away from one-man rule towards a reversion to a kind of more diffuse oligarchic rule, where a kind of a charmed circle of well-connected and wealthy families dominate the political process. And of course, it uses the Philippine military. It forms a more direct linkage with the Philippine military, certainly at this time in the 1980s, during the collapse of the Marcos regime, to protect civilian elected officials that are favorably disposed towards the bases. The Corazon Aquino administration allowed the bases to continue, and it indeed tried to renew American control of the bases in 1991. But because the Cold War had ended by that point, the bases were seen as what is called a declining asset, or what at that time was called a declining asset. The United States wasn't willing to fork over the required rents, economic aid, and the bases close with a kind of a whimper, of course, because the Cold War by that point had ended, and I think their strategic value had indeed declined. So you see a very composite security architecture in these three cases, right, during these Cold War decades, that are each within a very general framework and evolve in an overarching structure. So we need bases in Japan. If, for example, Okinawa becomes a problem for us, as it did in the 1960s, early 1970s, with various protest movements, yes, we can push it back into Japan proper, because that maneuver will allow us access to those bases that is projecting less resistance. So within an overarching structure of base access, we make all kinds of deals, recalibrations, recalculations. With South Korea, we need South Korean military labor. In that overarching framework, there is room for negotiation, there are room for deals, there is room for headbutting, but fundamentally, we seem to be committed to that overarching access to military labor. And in the Philippines, we need also base access during the Cold War and a civilian or military coalition that will simultaneously allow us access and prevent leftist social movements, subaltern social movements in effect, from endangering that access. All right. So that's the overarching Cold War security composite. Right. Now, if the United States, during these decades, with all of its wealth and all of its power, had to consider and concede to its allies, some would call them its clients, in the Asian rimland, it certainly must do something very, very similar today, in the sense that, of course, the United States is not as powerful as it once was, and there are all kinds of arguments that China is far more powerful today than the Soviet Union was at that time, economically speaking. Strategically, it's of course a very different story. And there is a disconnect, a disjointing of the landscape in Rimland Asia or Maritime Asia, in the sense that these three countries, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, are deeply reliant on their economic relationships with China. Okay? China is big, China is wealthy, and China is near. However, because China is big, wealthy, and near, it represents a level of threat, potential level of threat, that is far greater than the Soviet Union ever posed to these countries at that time. All right? Certainly for the Japanese, also for the Filipinos, I think there is a genuine fear that China might swallow them whole. The South Korean case, of course, is the most complex and the most complicated, in the sense that they are trying to maintain, or in many respects, decouple their security policies, their strategic military alliance, with their economic interests and their economic activities with respect to China. So there is this general shift in that the security interests of these three countries and the economic interests of these three countries do not necessarily and always align as consistently as they did in the past. However, because there are threats, there are dangers, particularly for Japan, and the Philippines, they want to balance against China by maintaining a security relationship with the United States. And it would benefit the United States, and I do think that the Biden administration does more or less understand this, that it has to be done through bilateral actions. These calls for a kind of Pacific NATO are extremely difficult and perhaps at best unworkable. Again, I stress I'm discussing possibilities here, not outcomes. Predicting outcomes is a dangerous game, and I don't want to play it. But the possibility of forming a multilateral security umbrella across Rimland Asia is extremely difficult. What makes it most difficult and almost intractable is a deep hostility and rivalry between the Republic of Korea and Japan. The prospect of stationing Japanese troops in Korea and Korean troops in Japan are remote at best. Hence, we must consider the very particular political dispensations, abilities of each particular ally. They're not They're not the same as they were during the Cold War necessarily, but each ally has a particular set of interests, a particular set of goods, if you like, or services that it can provide the United States in the contemporary era. It's not like we can homogenize the strategic landscape in these countries, but we hadn't done that before. All right. So this is something that I'm toying with regard to Kenneth Pyle's work. His notion of America's commitment to a liberal internationalism and an effort by the United States to homogenize, read, of course, Americanize the rest of the world is something that the US must be dissuaded from. It must allow for interconnectivity without convergence. This is Pyle's argument. The US needs interconnectivity without convergence. But in the security realm, this is nothing new. We've always had security interconnectivity without convergence. Each of these three countries certainly have provided distinct strategic security services. So in looking back to the past, it's not like we can do exactly what we did at that time in present day, but in looking back to the past, we can see that we have had a situation that is something like this before. Each of these three nodes, or each of these three points of containment, if you like, have always had a very distinct relationship with us and have always provided very distinct strategic services. And I don't think homogenization is the answer. Bilateral, composite, hub and spokes, security alliances are the answer. So I'll start again with Japan and go down. Japan has changed fundamentally the most, really. Since the ending of the Cold War, Japan's collapse into economic stagnation, certainly for several decades, the dissolution of the JSP, the leftist socialist opposition, the reconfiguration of the LDP from a kind of Yoshida school or Yoshida doctrine mainstream conservatism to a more right-wing Kishinobusuke type of LDP conservatism has made it willing, albeit very slowly, very gradually, but certainly the general tendency is there, to engage in strategic military containment of China with the United States. Right? It, of course, needs the US alliance. It's using basically a far hegemon to keep a near hegemon at bay. The far US hegemon is brought into Japanese territory to push China away. But I think the US alliance is also a very important shield that gives Japan time to build up its conventional military capacities. The US will benefit from that. And the US-Japan alliance, it can never be entirely equal, given the fact that Japan cannot be the United States, but it is moving in a more equalizing, or it is becoming a more equal conventional alliance. So if the US supports that, it can obtain strategic military labor, interoperability, force multiplication. These are the terms used in the IR community. That might look something like the relationship between, not entirely, but look more like the US-ROC, the US Republic of Korea relationship. Force multiplication, strategic projection of Japanese and American military labor, military power across the region. All right. That is a distinction which we are already kind of sort of seeing happening at this time. With regard to South Korea, its position towards North Korea, yes, it can provide military labor willingly. We have very close relations, joint command, wartime operational control by the United States of the ROC military. Yes, that's all there. With regard to North Korea, With regard to China, there is a deep and profound and quite understandable reluctance. And again, this is nothing new because since 2003, the PRC has been South Korea's largest trading partner. Indeed, as I believe, the South Koreans do more trade with the PRC than the US and Japan combined. All right, so this is clearly a very deep economic interest. So for the US to push South Korea into confrontation with China or to redirect its strategic power in a Chinese containment strategy would be difficult, and I think would make South Koreans face a very difficult choice, which they would not want to face. And I don't think they deserve to face that very difficult choice. However, if the United States maintains existing relationships with the South Korean elite, and expanding relationships in realms like space, cybersecurity, climate change, anti-piracy operations, and it provides a shield from a kind of backup shield from North Korean provocation, then the South Koreans will want the United States to stay put in South Korea. And in doing so, this is not because the South Koreans want this necessarily, but the de facto outcome will be that South Korea will be a buffer for Japan. It will make it easier for the United States and Japan to contain China from Japanese territory. Okay? And just as, say, US-Japan relations are starting to resemble or looking more like US-ROC relations during the Cold War, it is entirely possible with regard to China that US-ROC relations will be something like US-Japan relations during the Cold War. There will be pressures by the United States for ROC to shift its strategic power against China, to combine with the United States to contain the Chinese. And the South Koreans, like the Japanese during the Cold War, can obfuscate, can deter, can dither, can deflect. And the US is ultimately going to have to accept this because I think that buffer function of the South Korean state, ROC, is going to be absolutely crucial for a broader geostrategic vision. With regard to the Philippines, the United States knows all too well what American military bases can mean, the kind of resistance that they can generate. Therefore, again, it would behoove the United States to maintain a tight military relationship with the Philippine military, as it has really since George W. Bush's war on terror. Basically, that was the pretext, the reason for rekindling or retightening the relationship between the United States and the armed forces of the Philippines, the AFP, right? Because the AFP can deflect populist sentiments that are anti-American in nature, which it did. And this is painfully obvious. However far Duterte tried to move the Philippines away from the United States and towards China, he was compelled secretly, not so secretly, coerced by the AFP to walk back those comments, to walk back those policies, to tamp down efforts at moving away from the United States. So this US-AFP relationship is paying strategic dividends for the United States. However, that doesn't mean that the United States should reimpose itself on the Philippines in the manner that it did during the Cold War by building these gargantuan military bases. What is much more probable, and is indeed occurring, is the effort to inject American military power into Philippine military bases, make these bases in the Philippines interoperable, whereby US and Philippine military forces can jointly operate these bases. One of the ways in which the US, for example, has thinned its military presence on Okinawa after resistance to the US presence in 1995 during the protests against the sexual assault there, the massive protests, but certainly before and certainly thereafter, was to ramp up the interoperability, joint use of Japanese military bases on Okinawa. Something similar like this can happen here, and in doing so, the US can ensure that it will be able to thicken its presence in the event of a contingency and mobilize and lift off the Philippine military from the Philippines for joint exercises, joint maritime defense. Okay. And of course, we don't need to engage in coups. We don't necessarily need to support this electoral candidate, this right-wing demagogue, or this pro-American president. And I'm being very, very blunt now. It almost doesn't matter who the president is in the Philippines as long as the military is on side, because the military has sufficient power to pressurize elected Philippine officials in certain directions. They're not the sole actor. These military officers in the Philippines also align very closely with certain presidents and certain political factions. But I think they are the prime mover in this. So we've had interconnectivity without convergence before, and it probably looks like we're going to have something analogous to that again. So I'll leave it there, and I'd be happy to open it up to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Vartavarian, for those interesting comments, wide and sweeping across Asia here. So I'd like to now turn to our first discussant, and I'll turn the mic over to Enzo. So please take it away.
Thanks very much, James, and thank you, Mesrob, for an excellent presentation. I will make my remarks in response to the Philippines, where I have direct experience working on disaster preparedness and resilience projects over the past 6 years. I agree that there's definitely a strong relationship between the U.S. military and the armed forces of the Philippines, but I'm concerned that it might be slightly overstated in that it misses also a really strong connection between Philippine civil society and U.S. civil society in that period in which the Philippines was a protectorate of the United States. One in which the United States brought in English as a kind of national language for the Philippines was one that was very fundamental in sort of rooting connection between U.S. culture and Filipino culture. And in fact, English is used amongst the elite, certainly amongst the professional class, almost in preference to Tagalog, which was seen as internal colonizing language that would have taken over at the expense of some of the other main groups within the country. And so I think the Philippines is quite unique in Asia in its long history of Western colonialism, certainly first with the Spanish, then through a period of with the United States, with occupation by Japan during the Second World War, and then to the United States again before independence in 1946. So I think that relationship it somehow extends beyond simply a relationship between the two militaries, and it takes place at a more social level as well. In fact, there are a huge number of Filipinos that live in the United States, serve in the U.S. military, and there are many ways in which the two countries, I think, are connected. I think the period in which, especially in the past 10 years, one of the things that China has really done, and especially in the South China Sea, over which it claims nearly universal sovereignty, have really been for China to sort of project power, almost a hard power stance that none of the countries in that region are able to really counter effectively. And so they've attempted to unite through ASEAN and through multilateral fora a way to move China into a treaty on to force them into a kind of code of conduct for traversing the South China Sea, which China has been reluctant to engage in, and it has instead tried to rely on its own military power and bilateral relationships, and has stayed away from any kind of multilateral fora, saying that this is not a matter for multilateral fora, that it's instead a sovereign issue for themselves. And I think that that's actually not worked really in their favor, because it's created a lot of fear, a lot of antagonism, and it's prevented them from exploring the use of soft power in ways that might have otherwise helped them to develop relationships within the South China Sea. And instead, after the 2016 ruling in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that the Philippines actually won, which denied Chinese sovereign territorial claims of the South China Sea, they responded by effectively building islands and militarizing those islands, and so continue to project hard power in the region. And I think miss an opportunity to explore potential use of soft power as a way of reducing friction, reducing tension, and building relations in the region, which the United States, I think, does, and other allies do quite well. So you see, in response, for example, to Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, November of 2013, some 21 nations respond with their militaries to what was at that point the largest typhoon to have ever made landfall. And the US leads that international effort along with the AFP and 20 other militaries, and China is notably absent there. And so has failed to really take advantage of any use of or engagement in soft power, and has instead relied on hard power alone, which really, I think, has mitigated their influence and their impact in the region, has created a lot of fear and a lot of tension. I think two things are sort of now coming to the fore that really are going to begin to force some of these security issues. The first is climate change and climate change impacts. Sea level rise, changing weather patterns, storm surge, flooding in the Philippines is already driving migration, will continue to lead to forced migration, not only in that country, but throughout the region, and is leading to things like fishing becoming more scarce along the coast, and is driving fishing boats towards further and further away from the shore, thereby increasing the number of incidents where Chinese boats and boats from Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines come into contact with one another and in competition over scarce fishing resources and rights over various important parts of the South China Sea. And so I think that climate change presents a kind of moment where there's a decision that can be made about whether to embrace a soft power approach and look for common solutions to a common problem, or to further explore militarization and power, which almost invariably will lead to greater conflict than we've seen recently. I know we have limited time here, so I'm going to stop there with my remarks, but happy to continue. I want to make sure everyone else has a chance to participate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Enzo. Wonderful. I'll turn directly to Professor Eckert, and the mic is yours.
So thank you, James. Thank you, Mesrob. I'm very happy to participate here today. I'm in no sense a security expert, but I think from a South Korean perspective, Mesrob has put his finger on what I think is the greatest challenge in many respects for South Korea, and that is this trying to find some sort of balance between this growing antagonism between the United States and China. And of course, South Korea, true to its history and its geostrategic position, always has found itself in one kind of balancing act or another. I think you all probably know the famous saying that the Koreans like to quote about being a shrimp between whales, and getting crushed by those whales when those whales come into conflict. And of course, South Korea is not in any sense a shrimp in the way it was certainly in the late 19th century when Japan was becoming a major East Asian power and coming into conflict with the other surrounding powers on the Korean Peninsula. But the metaphor still holds, I think, with China and the United States. So I think Mesrob is right on point with that. I would say, I think you might be underestimating the extent of the problem, however, that South Korea is facing here. And there are several factors at play, some of which you've mentioned, which I think are maybe even more problematic or serious than you've indicated. One is simply the growing economic might of China in the area, and with respect to South Korea in particular. China is now South Korea's largest trading partner by far. Tens of thousands of South Koreans are going over to China to study. There are many kinds of relationships developing there. China, in a sense, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but looking at it sort of from the long historical point of view, China is becoming historically important again to South Korea, to the Korean Peninsula, as it had been for so many centuries before. So this economic relationship, I think, should not be underestimated, and the extent to which that will play a role in affecting the way the South Koreans may respond to any kind of crisis between the United States and China. I mean, a few years ago, the deployment of the THAAD, the missile defense system in South Korea, is maybe one example. China handled it very badly, and there was a backlash against China. And I think, as you point out, Mesrob, these relationships are complicated, and yet it also brought home, I think, to the South Koreans a certain growing dependency, if you will, on the Chinese economy. So this is only going to grow, I think, that economic importance of China in the region. So that's going to be one factor here that is going to be especially important, and you may need to stress even more in your analysis. The other is the relationship between North Korea and South Korea, which you also mentioned. And here, I think the South Koreans again recognize the importance of China in this relationship that they are trying to establish with North Korea. We don't know what the new president is going to be like, but certainly Moon Jae-in has pushed for better relations with North Korea, and this has involved also, I think, some frustration with the United States, but also a recognition that China is a key player here, and the relationship with China has to be one that allows a better development of North-South relations as well. So that's another factor here, I think, that one might cite with regard to the importance of China thinking in any kind of North Korean decisions in the future on security. The other, of course, another here is that South Korea is no longer the authoritarian system it was in the Cold War. Foreign policy is not decided top-down the way it used to be. Any South Korean government can't do just what it wants. And there are, many different views out there in South Korean society. I think with regard to China, I think there is concern and a kind of wariness, particularly with the Xi Jinping regime. Koreans know what, of course, has been happening in Hong Kong and so forth. And there is concern and distaste, I would say, for that. On the other hand, I think there is also within the South Korean public a recognition of the importance of China for almost all South Korean economic and foreign relations. And also there's a growing sort of critique of the United States post-Cold War. At one point, the US was the great ally, the great savior. Then It became a problem in the democratization movement. And I think it's a more complex view now. But again, I think the THAAD deployment is another example here of how one can see a growing South Korean dissatisfaction with American involvement in South Korean security issues, particularly where they might involve getting South Korea dragged into some kind of war. So these are all, I think, issues that suggest the depth of the problem that South Korea faces with finding some sort of balance here. It's a very, very delicate sort of tightrope that the South Koreans have to walk. And I wanted to ask you, you know, in your sort of schema, as you see the United States policies evolving here towards South Korea, you know, what are the limits do you see of what the United States might ask? And also, what are the limits of South Korea might do, given this very delicate balance that South Korea faces between the United States and China? And then very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, your whole presentation, in a way, I think rests on the premise that the United States is going to be very thoughtful and careful and deliberate in its policies towards Korea and towards China and so forth. And that is great if that turns out to be the case. I hope it does. But, you know, as Enzo was suggesting, you know, history is very contingent. There are all sorts of looming crises out there, including in the South China Sea. And events could happen very, very quickly, and there could be requests suddenly flowing from Washington to Seoul that are completely unimaginable at this moment. And one wonders, you know, given what I just said about the delicate balance and so forth, you know, how that is going to play out. So I will just stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carter. And then Mesrob will have a chance to respond after our final discussion as well. So just hold on. And then just to remind the audience that there'll be some time for some questions afterwards where you can use the raise hand function and ask your question, or use the Q&A function as well. So let me turn to our final discussant. I'll turn it over to Professor Aki Nakai.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vartavarian. It was a wonderful talk. And also thank you, Dr. Robson, for inviting me as a discussant. I'm also currently working on the origins of US alliance in East Asia with focus on Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So I really enjoyed Dr. Vartavarian's talk. I think that Dr. Vartavarian's talk contributed to the debate on the US security partnership in East Asia in two major ways. First is most previous works on this topic have been focusing on the respective US security partnership, but without the examination of other US security partnership at the same time, it would be difficult to understand the goals of the United States in the regions. Yes, US security partners are bilateral, but all of these security partnerships are in fact multilateral. So Dr. Vartavarian's research is a critical effort to cover all three US important security partnerships simultaneously. Second is we are now witnessing the proliferation of bilateral and multilateral security partnership in the regions. So the comparative case studies between the now and the past development will be helping us better understand the trends and the conditions of US security partnership in East Asia. So his talk just did that. So I have a few comments on the US-Japan alliance from basically Japanese viewpoints. First, his talk mainly focused on US side of strategic calculations and the Japanese calculations through the US viewpoints. But it would be probably helpful if we also discuss Japanese calculations through the Japanese viewpoints. Dr. Vartavarian correctly cited Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru and his policies' impact on post-war Japanese security policies. But it would be important to note that Prime Minister Yoshida viewed primary security threat coming from inside, not outside. In other words, internal communist subversions was far more threatening to the Japanese national securities than external attack from the Soviet Union and or the PRCs. How many tanks Japan would build, how many bombers Japan would build, it would not matter in order to handle internal threat. So PM Yoshida thought the economic development would help the public feel less attractive to the ideology of communism and socialism. The economic growth would be the best defense to handle internal communist subversions. Second point is I would say it's really important to note that Japan has a sense that current and upcoming security environment surrounding Japan is or would be the worst since the end of the Second World War. During the Cold War, the main Cold War battlefield was in Europe. In the early stage of post-Cold War era, the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait remained a hotspot. But for the Japanese point of view, the issues of those two hotspots was if the US responded security contingency in those two hotspots, how would Japan support US military action there? But now, because of China's and because of territorial dispute with China, Japan has become one of the first front lines. And this sense basically motivated the change in the recent Japanese security policies. And lastly, I kind of want to ask the question to Dr. Vartavarian. You expect the US security partnership in the Indo-Pacific to survive, which I agree. But my question is what would be the necessary and the sufficient conditions, if you point one conditions, in order to achieve a deeper institutionalizations among the US security partners in the futures? So I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakai. Wonderful comments. Thank you to all our discussants, actually. So I'd like to give Mesrob a few moments to respond if he would like to any or some of the questions at least, and then we'll open up for questions after that. So Mesrob, I turn it back to you, please.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you all for your input and insights, and I'll do my best to try and address these questions, comments, and concerns. So I'll start with Enzo and go down the list as they were asked. In terms of the cultural linkages and the soft power aspects, yes, that is all very important. But for me, it's always very fascinating to see how military the linkages are outside a strategic framework, in the sense of Filipinos providing military labor within the United States, either by joining the United States military as a path or an expedited fast track to citizenship, and indeed functioning as base labor. A lot of the military bases in San Diego, for example, so I'm from Los Angeles and I've taken more than a few trips down to San Diego. A lot of those are worked through Philippine military laborers. I think, as I understand it, Filipinos are becoming the largest ethnic group in the state of Hawaii, last I heard, or last I checked. They also play a tremendous role in military base labor, Fort Hickam, Pearl Harbor, places like this. So yes, there is a strategic military alliance and there is a soft power component we need to consider. But one of the very important functions that the Filipino-US alliance, one of its main platforms, is the role that the Filipinos play within the US military establishment, not just as soldiers in the Philippines, but also workers on bases, people who support workers on bases within these Filipino communities in the United States. And because what Tagalog, I think, is the fourth most widely spoken language in the United States today, gives the United States a tremendous amount of, well, soft power leverage, which is, I think, based on this this military labor aspect. Naturally, you have other things with multinational corporations using these call centers in Manila and Quezon City that we all come into contact with. So yes, that soft power aspect is there, but the military side of it, beyond that hard edge, beyond the hard power military side, there is a soft power military side, or an indirect military side to the U.S. Philippine cultural linkages. And I think also why I emphasize the military so deeply within the contemporary context is because it makes very clear the institutional linkages that exist between the two during this populist challenge, this Duterte populist challenge that attempted to unravel the US-Philippine alliance, basically brought to the fore the resilience and the depth of institutional linkages. And I think these institutional linkages are primarily, in the Philippines themselves, are primarily military and strategic. That's why I wanted to foreground that aspect. Now, as to the Korean case, yes, Professor Eckert is correct. The extent of the problem is extremely complicated. And again, it depends on, and yes, it requires delicacy and deep consideration. But I do think that there are people in the US government, Korea specialists, who understand the subtleties and the complexities, and not just Korea specialists, also people like Kurt Campbell, who was in the Obama administration, now is in the Biden administration, do know about these things and do know about these subtleties. With regard to North Korea, again, there is going to be a kind of schizophrenia, given that, from my analysis, conservative presidents in South Korea are fairly anti-North, at least thus far, and will depend upon the United States alliance to contain or deter a a North Korean threat to the South. So we can expect this bipolarity within the South Korean political system itself, because I think South Korean presidents are still fairly powerful and can nudge South Korean foreign policy in particular directions. Moon Jae-in did move things substantially towards reconciliation, just as Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye moved it towards confrontation. So we can expect that schizophrenia, if you like, or that rapid shifting according to the administration in power. Therefore, the United States-ROC Security Alliance can very easily maintain its robustness and strength with respect to North Korea. But with respect to China, this is my recommendation to Washington, if anyone is listening, you need as much passivity as possible. Passivity with respect to China on the part of the ROC, deeper engagement on the security hard power questions with respect to the DPRK. And I do think the US has to accept this, because as you said, South Korea is no longer the shrimp that it once was, and it is a more equal partner that can provide a multiplicity of services to the United States in cybersecurity, in outer space, in climate change, things that it could not do before. And in exchange for that, hopefully the US can consider these specific interests. Nevertheless, in sustaining a kind of garrison passivity with respect to the PRC, the ROK is still contributing to the wider security architecture, because it will make it easier for the US and Japan to conduct containment against the Chinese at base. Now, of course, and these I think are some of the limits that should be placed on what the US can ask and what the South Koreans can legitimately accept to provide or refuse to provide in in the wider relationship. And of course, certainly when it comes to broader Chinese strategic questions, let's leave South Korean military labor put. Let's not draw it into things like the Taiwan Strait, where it's not going to go. And I think most US commanders understand that. And I think most US policymakers would do well to understand that as well. If we want to sustain the robustness of the alliance and not fray it on something that, it would be a shame to fray it on something like that. The US-China rivalry, given its history and given its evolving complexity and its deepening and deepening value to the United States in particular, I think. Now, as to the Japan calculus, Aki Nakai's question, Professor Nakai's question, yes, I do agree that fundamentally security in the Cold War era, particularly in the 1950s, meant internal security, in that the Japanese police were the primary means to control the population and prevent protests from pressurizing the government into a general strategic passivity, that is Cold War neutrality, right? Now the threat is external, not so much internal, indeed. And that requires a militarization of Japanese foreign policy that was henceforth unthinkable. This is something that I think the Abe government, the second Abe government from 2012 to 2020, did substantively achieve in a de facto sense. There is a de jure formality in that Article 9's revision for all of Abe's efforts did not happen. What happened was a reinterpretation that put collective security back on the table and externalized and hardened militarized Japanese diplomacy, hardened Japanese power and externalized it more thoroughly in a conjunction with the United States. That's very true. So what condition do we need to deepen these alliances and threats? Well, at base, I think there is, of course, the China problem and the need to balance against China. But I think there's a more subtle and interesting problem here, in that the inability of the ROC, South Korea and Japan, to mesh in a security sense is going to make both Japan and South Korea more reliant on the United States. And I think this is at base unfortunate, and there are all kinds of reasons for this, history issues, yes, certainly, but there is also a political genealogical problem here, which is going to deepen the US-Japan alliance indirectly. The current LDP dispensation, the current avatar, if you like, the current manifestation of the LDP, I think is incapable of accepting Chinese superiority and aligning with the ROC on security questions, given its genealogy, given that these are basically the grandchildren of Kishinosuke and company. This revisionist dispensation, and this is where I disagree with Pyle, who sees Japanese conservatism as malleable and pragmatic. Not now, not with regard to China, not with regard to South Korea. In IR, realism dictates that the ROC and Japan get along to counteract North Korean pressure, certainly, but they refuse to do so because of the very stark reality that the philosophy, the genealogy, the history of this current manifestation of the LDP makes subordination to China and an equal partnership with South Korea profoundly difficult. And this is going to give the US much more room in which to interject itself and involve itself in these security questions. So I think that's what's going to deepen the alliance more than anything else at base. So.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mesrob.
Thank you.
So I think we have some time for questions from the audience, and those in the audience could, like I said, use the raise hand function or the Q&A function. I'll be happy to curate those as they come in. While people are thinking, I wonder if I might just begin with a kind of a question that has been on my mind, and I'm not a specialist of international security and all these things, but one of the things that I've really paid attention to is these realignments that have taken place, particularly in trade agreements across that involve the U.S. after its pullout by the Trump administration in 2017 from the TPP, but then watching these new kind of alignments that are happening and really interesting kind of relationships that are being established, particularly in the formation of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership on the one hand, which includes a limited selection of those countries, both in the Asia Pacific region, and then including Canada and Mexico, but the US left out of that. And then what's coming up beginning on January 1st of 2022, which is the new RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which then brings players like the Philippines, South Korea, China into the mix here. And so I'm just wondering if any of you had any thoughts on those kind of trade agreements and negotiations across those and how those factor into the mix here. It's just a really interesting alignment, it seems to me, of who's included in which ones of those, which ones are excluded, whether the US will ever be brought, I mean, if they ever try to come back into the CPTPP, what's going to be required of them to re-enter that? And it seems as if power has been diminished by pulling out of the TPP. So anyway, I was just curious. It confuses me. At the same time, it intrigues me of just what all this means, the relationship between trade and business negotiations versus political and other issues like that. So anybody can enlighten me, I'd really appreciate it.
I could maybe do some enlightening, hopefully. But the at base, what's very interesting about the TPP question is that yes, naturally, it complicated regional integration efforts and regional homogenization efforts in that part of the world, which I think speaks to my argument in the sense that bilateralism and particularism is more important. We're seeing current efforts by the Biden administration to lessen the tariffs on steel and with Japan, steel and aluminum, I believe. There are current talks going on at that level. So with the withdrawal from the TPP, we fundamentally, I think, deepened the importance of the bilateral connection because we weakened the multilateral connection. However, what's happening currently, given the passage of this massive infrastructure bill by the Biden team, is that, yes, Biden himself is surprisingly like Trump in that he is not so much inclined to free trade agreements because he wants to protect American jobs, American workers, trade unions, labor unions, which are a very key component of his supporter base. But at the same time, this passage of the infrastructure bill will potentially enable and ease global trade connectivity. I think that's its long-term motive. Yes, it will provide jobs, and yes, it will empower labor unions, but at the same time, you're opening the door for deeper Pacific-wide economic integration. How that's going to play out in future is really an open question. But for the time being, I think bilateralism is just as important, if not more important than it ever was, given the TPP withdrawal. But this, as this infrastructure comes online, that certainly might change the question. And of course, the nature of commerce being digitized and further and further entering the cybersphere also is a new thing. You don't necessarily need trade agreements in that respect. It can take a kind of cyber form, if you like, of digital transactions, digital commerce, e-commerce, and things like that. So.
Great, thank you. Here, I know Professor Eckert, you have another question, I believe, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, James. I just wanted to follow up on Mesrob's comments to us. And I fully agree that we have had and have some really terrific experts in Washington on the Korean issue. But history also suggests that too often the governments ignore the experts' good opinions and ideas, and policies go far astray. So I'm a little perhaps less optimistic than you about that. But I wanted to push you on this fascinating phrase that you had, which was garrison passivity. Because on one level, it sounds a bit like an oxymoron, at least given this incredibly thin and delicate tightrope on which the Koreans have to walk in the event of an emergency. What exactly do you mean when you say that? What do you envision in sort of concrete terms?
The best I can do here is through a kind of analogy, and this is where I want to bring in Taiwan, because Taiwan did play precisely this function with respect to Japan. Again, the political realities of those early Cold War decades, in which basically from about 1950 to about 1971, maybe even until 1979, Taiwan becomes a strategic offshoot of the United States. It basically becomes a part of the United States. Nevertheless, over which the US has a tremendous amount of leverage. Nevertheless, given the political realities of that time, the US blocks, denies, squelches any attempts at projecting Taiwanese troops into its wider Cold War strategic activities. The Taiwanese want to do it. They're constantly eager to jump into Korea, to jump into South Vietnam, and the US blocks it off because it would generate a tremendous cascade of a massive Chinese reaction that would lead to all kinds of dangerous outcomes. Therefore, you are a garrison state, Taiwan, you remain passive. And because you are a garrison state, because you have a deep militaristic presence, you're acting as a buffer behind which Japan can develop. I think one of the reasons the United States didn't press Japan much harder to rearm in the 1950s, 60s, 70s was because it already had military labor from South Korea that it could mobilize and deploy, and a passive garrison state in Taiwan that could act as a buffer, all right? In the Korean case, the passivity comes depending upon the target in question. If the target is North Korea, then yes, we're going to do full legal Part 25, and we're going to reassemble all kinds of big and intimidating operations should the need arise. Although to the Biden administration's credit, maybe because they're so busy with other things, they have not really ramped up those exercises again yet. They were so occupied with AUKUS and the infrastructure issue and now the Build Back Better agenda that I think their North Korea policy has not yet fully gelled and is not yet clear. But when it comes to common enemies, when it comes to common interests, then that garrison can become kinetic. You can activate it, mobilize it, and actively engage with it. When the political risks are greater than the political benefits to activation, then passivity certainly serves that kind of function. Also, I think the issue with China and North Korea, if I could maybe just get to that very briefly, and this is something I draw on Andrei Lankov from his own work. He is saying essentially that China's leverage over North Korea is that of a sledgehammer, not of a vice. In other words, China has so much power over North Korea, yes, but it can retaliate against North Korea. It can basically eliminate North Korea through retaliatory actions or hostile intent. How much it can pressurize and calibrate North Korean foreign policy to reconcile itself with South Korean interests, it's more delicate, it's more subtle than, I don't know if it, according to Lankov, it really can't do it. It can ruin North Korea if it wants to, But can it nudge North Korea into a more peaceful and predictable relationship with South Korea? That's less clear, according to his work, which I think is pretty spot on. So this garrison passivity is target specific. If it's North Korea and there's a conservative administration that wants to ramp up hostilities for all kinds of populist, nationalistic reasons, then yeah, we can certainly accommodate that. We have that capability. But when it comes to China, let's keep the South Koreans passive, because if they are pushed into mobilization against the Chinese, then we might endanger that buffer that Japan needs to build behind and project its power behind. Yeah.
Thank you, Mesrob. We have no standing questions right now, but if either Enzo or Aki Nakai would like to chime in at all, otherwise I have one kind of final question at some point, but I'd like to give you both a chance to comment if you would like, or if not, no problem. Yes, Aki, please.
Thank you. So I just want to mention about kind of effect of ROK and Taiwan as a garrison state, which would probably provide a positive impact to the Japanese national security. But if we go back to during the Cold War, let's say in the 1960s, already we started to see the tension between the Soviet Union and the PRCs. And then in the 1970s, 60s, actually PRC was on the same side of Japan and the United States. So I'm not sure that ROK and the PRC, as a garrison state, was actually really was a part of Japanese security calculations. Japanese calculation at the time was ROC, North Korea, and even Soviet Union did not have amphibious capability to send their troops to the Japanese homeland. At the time, Japanese security experts calculated maybe Soviet Union had only, have a capacity to send 2 army divisions into the Hokkaido areas. So that's a very, very limited, threat from Japanese, security planners' perspective. That's why Japanese did not feel like they need to really, start increase their, military capability drastically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm taking it, I think, more from an American perspective, and maybe this is just the perspective I'm best able to discuss. In that, if you're looking at the drawdown of U.S. troops in Japan, United States forces Japan, throughout the 1950s and 60s, certainly during the Eisenhower era, one of the reasons at that time, if you're looking at what they're discussing in National Security Council and meetings at very high level, between the president and his key advisors, one of the reasons the United States can draw down its presence in these places throughout the Japanese mainland is because we can redeploy the troops to ROK, or we can redeploy them to Okinawa, which the United States then occupied. And I do think that this is just my looking at the record and what people were saying at the time. One of the reasons the ROK-US alliance really does ramp up in the 1960s during the early Park Chung-hee regime, pre-Yushin Park Chung-hee regime, is because of Anpo, because of the 1960 protests and the very deep reluctance thereafter of the United States to even consider pressurizing the Japanese to involve themselves in Indochina in a very deep way. Well, that was kind of that wasn't good. We don't want to see a repeat of Anpo. We have the Rock. We have literally, I think this is how they saw it. We have a Japanese militaristic garrison state in South Korea, led by people who used to be part of that military imperial system running South Korea in the 1960s. If they can give us the military labor we need, then we don't need to pressurize the Japanese, and we don't really want to. because Anpo really, really was a big, big crisis. If not for a fundamental rethinking of the alliance relationship and the foregrounding of economic development rather than security questions in the US-Japan alliance, then of course the security questions are still there, but they are masked. The Japanese public is deflected, diverted from that security partnership by a deepening economic relationship. And also we can give our Harvard colleagues our due. Edwin Reischauer plays a role in this, a tremendously important role in sentimentalizing the US-Japan alliance, making it about a kind of common, kind-hearted, genteel friendship, partnership, not a superpower patron mobilizing strategic services from a subordinate client. That I think was Reischauer's major contribution to that. You could also credit the Kennedy administration for rethinking that alliance. But at base, none of that, for my money, as we say, none of that would have worked if the South Korean military state, garrison state, wasn't fully formed by that point and very, very willing to engage in the Indochina War. Then I think it would have been a very different story. Edwin O or no. I mean, yeah, it would have been something else entirely. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mesrob. We're just about at time, but I wanted to give Enzo an opportunity. I saw you raise your hand to have the final comment here, and thank you.
Maybe just one last question for Mesrob. What relationship, if any, do you see between sort of greater military expansion and expression of military power on China's part is related to the government's own legitimacy vis-a-vis its population?
The PRC government's legitimacy? Yes, naturally. And again, this is nothing new. This is really nothing new, and we need to consider this. One of the reasons the Taiwan Straits crises dragged on as long as they did was because the Mao regime used it as a means to mobilize the population, to conduct its political campaigns against not just, to consolidate the power of the PRC, but also to consolidate the power of the Maoist, radicalist, revolutionary faction within the PRC state. This is an old story, and it remains ongoing. I think Xi Jinping is using these tactics and methods to whip up support, right? Nevertheless, I do think there is a need for US containment of China, because if you don't contain them, they are going to push forward with it. If they're saying there's no pushback, they are going to push forward. That's just the nature of great powers and how they act, be they Chinese, American, or anything else. But it's an old story. And again, the Biden infrastructure package itself, an element that allowed Republican support for that passage was the China challenge. I think this was a recurring stream in the debate. If we don't do it, the Chinese are going to outpace us. The Chinese have been investing more in infrastructure than us. By God, we're going to invest more in infrastructure than they ever can. And this is a way. It's unfortunate, but bipartisan consensus in the U.S. is ultimately premised on external antagonization of an enemy. If we're doing it, the Chinese are going to do it, and we've both done it in the past. It's nothing new. It's really nothing new. So.
Great. Well, that actually brings us up to a really good place to draw this to a close. I actually was going to, if there had been more time, I was sort of hoping to hear people's reflection on, since current is in the title here, I was thinking even current as of last night, to actually look off into the future about the Biden-Xi summit that took place and reflect a little bit on what you sort of saw in between the lines there. And also the rather striking juxtaposition of that is that we also had Kim Jong-un come out for the first time in a month and take a public photograph. And I'm sure the timing on that must have been somewhat coordinated, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, it was I did find that interesting to have both of those on the front pages of newspapers. But we'll leave that for another day. There's plenty of very important and complicated issues here that are going to be fascinating to watch. And I appreciate Mesrob's talk and the wonderful responses to get us thinking about a lot of these things. So thank you all again for participating. Let me end once again thanking Mesrob for instigating this or catalyzing this discussion, and really appreciated very much the insights from all the panelists today. So thank you, and thanks to the audience for joining us. So thank you all.